I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Distinguished Author Series event featuring Elizabeth Economy, author of The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State. This book and author series at IPI is now more than 40 books and authors old, and in choosing the volumes, we try to steer a course that roughly follows the headlines. In fact, it was originally called Behind the Headlines. So in recent years, we've highlighted books about the Middle East, the Arab Spring, terrorism, drone warfare, Iran, Iraq, ISIS, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Russia, the global refugee crisis, and electoral politics and convulsive conflicts in Africa. More recently, we've had successive books on the rise of illiberalism, nationalism, and nativism in Europe and, of course, in the United States. It's been 3 years since we focused on China with Thomas Christensen's The China Challenge, shaping the choices of a rising power. And even in that relatively short period, there's been such dynamic change with notable global dimensions in China that I was determined to turn our attention this spring to a book on the subject, and then I got lucky. I was delighted in January to obtain a galley print of Liz Economy's much anticipated new book on China with a May publishing date. We're talking about a country with 20% of the world's population, the world's largest standing army, an economy that is the world's second largest, a new sense of itself and its place in the world, and a bold and freshly empowered new leader whose ultimate objective is the rejuvenation of a great Chinese nation that he believes has been marginalized and humiliated for too long by the West and notably by the United States. It is now an economy that has been growing over the past 2 decades at an average 9+% growth rate, and that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and into the middle class. Its leader, Xi Jinping, gained dominant political influence and power at a recent party congress that has brought comparisons to the personality cult surrounding Mao himself. And going forward, Xi thinks big. His ambitious signature Belt and Road Initiative involves massive investment in more than 60 nations across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. China spends 3 times the amount we do on infrastructure, and what that has wrought in China is stunningly clear to anyone who travels there, particularly someone like me who first went there more than 40 years ago as a journalist, when Beijing was still commonly referred to as Peking, and a principal mode of transportation around the capital was the bicycle. Modern China is defying the long-time conventional wisdom that its penchant for state control and secrecy would forever hold it back from seriously competing with the West. Just this past weekend, the Washington Post had a front-page story saying that young, cutting-edge scientists are choosing China over the US as a more supportive place to pursue their research. And yesterday, the lead editorial in the Wall Street Journal warned with alarm of the threat to free navigation of the waters of the South China Sea, represented by China's increasingly aggressive military buildup in the area. It's a hell of a story, and Liz Economy, besides being a recognized scholar, is a really good storyteller. The narrative in the book is deeply researched and well argued, but Liz can also be refreshingly blunt. In her blog in January, she reviewed some pronouncements on the state of US and China competition, and she wrote, quote, "Let me offer an alternative argument. We suck, but China does too." Books are for sale at the door, and I will make sure we finish early so Liz will have time to sign copies and chat with you individually. Now, finally, you may have noticed that I liked Ian Bremmer's exuberant and astonished reaction to this book so much that I included it in the invitation. So please join me in welcoming to IPI Elizabeth Economy, author of The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, and be prepared in Ian Bremmer's phrase to be freaked out. You're on.
Thank you so much, Warren, for the lovely introduction. And it's terrific to be here to have the opportunity to talk about Xi Jinping and the next revolution, the third revolution, with such a distinguished audience. So I'd like just to begin by taking you back, not back too far, just to October of 2017, when Xi Jinping was reselected as General Secretary of the Communist Party. And in his marathon 3.5-hour speech, there was one phrase I thought that really stuck out. He said, "China has stood up, grown rich, become strong, and is moving to center stage." And I think this one phrase, better than almost anything else, encapsulates the three revolutions that China has experienced over the past 70 years. The first revolution, of course, is Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong stood up. He stood up against foreign invaders, and he stood up against the ruling party, the Kuomintang, and he created the contemporary Chinese Communist Party state. The second revolution, Deng Xiaoping, is where China grew rich. And Deng himself termed the 30 years of reform and opening up, roughly from the late 1970s, early 1980s until 2012, the second revolution himself. And that's a period where he introduced the market into the Chinese economy, civil society blossomed, China established its first non-governmental organizations, Deng welcomed foreign influence, both in terms of ideas and culture, but also capital. And he maintained a low-profile foreign policy in order to focus on developing the economy and raising up the living standard of the Chinese people. The third revolution is Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping, in his own words, says China has become strong and is moving to center stage. And I think that really is at the heart of Xi Jinping's third revolution. It's at the heart of his great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation in an effort to reclaim a degree of centrality for China on the global stage. In many respects, I think Xi's revolution upends Deng Xiaoping's second revolution. He is transforming the way that China governs at home and the way that it engages with the outside world. So what I'd like to do in 20 minutes or so is just sketch out sort of the four fundamental ways in which I see this revolution taking place, sort of the four transformative processes underway within China today. The first is the move from Deng Xiaoping's collective system of governance to a much more single authoritarian leader form of governance. Xi Jinping has amassed an enormous amount of institutional power, and he's done it in a very step-by-step, methodical manner. He began, I would argue, when he very first stepped on stage at the Great Hall of the People in 2012 and assumed his first tenure, 5-year tenure as General Secretary. And he talked about the need to address corruption. And he said corruption, if not addressed, could be the death of the Chinese Communist Party and even the death of the Chinese state. And he has launched an anti-corruption campaign like no other anti-corruption campaign. In contrast to anti-corruption campaigns, and they have been frequent throughout Chinese history, Mao Zedong launched the first one in 1951, and typically they wax and they wane. They may last for a year or two, and then they'll pick up again. But Xi Jinping, every year for the past 5 years, in his anti-corruption campaign, more Chinese officials have been detained and arrested than the year before. So last year in 2017, 527,000 Chinese officials were arrested. And since China has a 99% prosecution rate, you can imagine that, in fact, once people have been arrested, that pretty much is the end of the story. Now, a lot of people have looked at the anti-corruption campaign and understood it as an effort by Xi simply to target his political enemies. I would say that he does not have 527,000 officials who are his political enemies, but there's a good study out of Harvard that shows that about 40% of the officials at the vice ministerial level or above who've been detained or arrested, in fact, are in some way tied to Xi Jinping's political competitors. So there is probably an element in which Xi Jinping has used this anti-corruption campaign to consolidate his own political power. In addition, Xi very quickly assumed control of most of the important leadership commissions and committees that sit on top of the ministries and oversee broad areas of Chinese policy, both domestic and foreign policy. So this could be cyber policy, it could be economic reform, be national security. Typically, you would have Li Keqiang, the premier, sit on top of the Economic Reform Commission, but instead Xi Jinping assumed control of almost all of the important commissions. And this gives him, again, broad oversight over virtually every area of important policy, as well as independent sort of sources of political support, because each of these commissions has its own staff. It's like its own little political base of support for Xi. In addition, Xi Jinping, if you recall, back in 2017 in October, did something unexpected. He failed to signal who his successor would be in 2022. So he broke with 25 years of precedent in not signaling, right, who was going to come next. And then, of course, in what got a lot of media attention just this past spring in March, the Constitution was amended to allow for Xi Jinping to serve as president of the country, at least for 3 terms or as many as he's able to serve. So it had been a 2-term limit, but now there is no term limit. So Xi now effectively can sit in 3 of the most important positions within the Chinese Communist Party and government: General Secretary of the Communist Party, President of the country, and Chairman of the Central Military Commission. So Xi Jinping overall, right, has amassed, I think, an unprecedented, really, amount of institutional power. The second sort of transformational element in this third revolution is the reassertion of the Communist Party into Chinese political and economic life. So one of the hallmarks of the Deng era was really the withdrawal of the party from many of its responsibilities. So later on, Zhu Rongji, for example, expended a lot of energy beginning the process of dismantling state-owned enterprises. Under Xi Jinping, we've seen that state-owned enterprises have not, in fact, continued to be dismantled, but in fact have been enhanced. But I think there are many other ways in which we've seen the reassertion of the party. For example, in the massive surveillance system that's being put in place in China today. Right now, there are about 176 million cameras that are looking for facial recognition. By 2020, China wants to have 626 million of these cameras. They're pursuing voice recognition. They want to be able to listen in on a phone conversation and be able to identify exactly which 2 people out of 1.3 or more billion people are engaging in this conversation. And while some of this can be used certainly to target criminals and other things, one could imagine also that it will be a very effective mechanism for looking at what's going on in terms of political dissidence that might be occurring, or broad-scale movements that might be burbling up. So there's the element of sort of a repressive surveillance system, as well as a new social credit system. And I'm sure many of you have read about this in the newspaper. There's an effort underway in China to develop a government database for social sort of trustworthiness, determining the trustworthiness of each individual Chinese. It's a system right now that has many pilots. It's not one national system, so it's unclear exactly what all the metrics are going to be. But for example, some of the things that they're looking at are: have you defaulted on a loan? Have you participated in a political protest? Are your friends good or bad actors? Have you jaywalked? In one of the experiments, there were as many as 1,200 different characteristics that they were looking at. That proved to be too many, and that pilot has not moved forward. But these are the kinds of things that they're looking at. And your score will determine things like whether or not you can board an airplane. If you've defaulted on a loan, you may not be able to get on a plane. Already there are 6 or 7 million people in China who can't get on a plane or on a high-speed train. It may determine whether you can send your children to a school, to a top-notch school, or whether you get to jump the line at the airport or in a popular restaurant. So again, the parameters have yet to be set, but it's very much a way of the party beginning to, again, reassert itself in a very micromanaging way in the Chinese society and Chinese political life. We also see some of this in the Chinese economy, where the party has begun to activate party cells within not only state-owned enterprises, but also private enterprises and joint ventures. So if you look at the role of a party cell within a state-owned enterprise or a private enterprise, really, it was to receive, the party members within the enterprise would get guidance from the top. Maybe Xi Jinping gives a speech, they read the speech, they talk about the speech, they understand the speech, and they practice whatever is in the speech. Or they say, oh, we're going to have a tree planting campaign, you should lead this effort within, your particular enterprise. Now, though, Xi Jinping is pushed to have these party committees become much more active in terms of deciding things like where an enterprise should invest, pushing to have the head of the party committee become the chair of the board of the enterprise. So a lot of people are concerned about this because, of course, many of these people don't necessarily have the investment experience to be making these decisions. And so I've talked to, for example, multinationals who have said that they're being told to invest in a certain area because it's an area that's targeted for economic development, but it really makes no sense for their own enterprise. So they're pushing back hard. Also, tech and private entrepreneurs are concerned about this growing potential role of the party in making decisions for them. For example, one of the things I talk about in the book is a case where the head of a major Chinese technology company was told to invest in a big state-owned enterprise. And he said, okay, I'll invest my own money, but I'm not investing the money of my company in this state-owned enterprise because he didn't want them to be intermingled and intertwined. He wanted to retain the independence of his own firm. But how long that can continue, I think, remains to be seen. So there are many new pressures that are being placed upon the business community to become, in some respects, greater agents of the party state. And I don't mean that in a nefarious term, but really just to say Xi Jinping likes to keep control over the levers of the economy, and this is an important way that he can begin to do that. The third sort of transformative element in Xi's revolution is the degree to which Xi Jinping is not necessarily welcoming foreign influence and ideas, but instead creating a virtual wall of restrictions or regulations that is designed to allow him to be able to control more closely what comes in and what goes out of the country. So very early on, for example, we saw efforts to tell university professors in China not to use foreign textbooks, or at least, at the very least, to get permission before they would use a foreign textbook, right? Because there's a lot of fear of foreign ideas, or what has become known in China recently as hostile foreign forces. Hostile foreign forces are blamed for many things. For protests, some people blamed hostile foreign forces for the stock market crash in 2014, 2015. But these vague, nefarious, hostile foreign forces are out there, and Xi Jinping is determined to limit the ability by which sort of these ideas come in. I think one of the most significant sort of policies that he adopted was the passage of the law on the management of foreign NGOs. That was implemented in January of 2017. If you look before that, you would see that there were about 7,000 foreign non-governmental organizations in China, and they were very actively engaged in things like environmental protection or poverty alleviation, sometimes working with migrant children or developing the rule of law in many different ways.
There's something happened today on that you've been asked to comment on, yes?
It's a little bit different, but I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Yeah, that comes from our government as opposed to the Chinese government. So there were about 7,000 of these NGOs. Now, after the passage of the law, and so all the NGOs now have to re-register, and registration is moved from the Ministry of Civil Affairs to the Ministry of Public Security, which I think signals in some way the way that these NGOs are being viewed, right? The Ministry of Public Security deals with threats, right, to public security. So that's the sort of umbrella under which the NGOs are now being put. So you look today at the field of foreign non-governmental organizations, and you find there are somewhere between 300 and 400, right? So roughly 4% of what there was before the law was passed. And the reason this matters is because it's not simply about what the foreign NGOs were helping to do, but really foreign NGOs were a major source of support both institutional support, financial support for domestic NGOs in China. At one point, for example, foreign NGOs and foundations were responsible for about 90% of the funding of domestic environmental NGOs in China. So removing them from the landscape of China's civil society, it constrains not only the engagement with the international community, but really serves to constrain, in some respects, the development of domestic civil society within China. I think China's Made in China 2025 is another example of the sort of effort to protect the home front from foreign competition. So Made in China 2025, I'm sure many of you are aware, is one of the things that President Trump and his team is targeting. It's basically an industrial plan that says that China would like, in 10 critical sort of cutting edge areas of technology, everything from robotics to artificial intelligence, to new materials. China would like by 2025 for 80% of the domestic market, up to 80% of the domestic market, to be controlled by Chinese firms, right? To be dominated by Chinese firms, and of course for Chinese firms to be global competitors. So, many foreign firms are calling foul on this, and China said they're only just ambitious targets. They're not really set in stone. But if you look at a number of different areas of technology, and battery technology, et cetera, you'll find that China sets up many sort of small institutional barriers that prevent open competition. I'll just give you one quick example in the area of battery technology that I look at in the book. At one point, China passed a regulation that said all batteries for electric cars that would be used in cars that would get access to subsidies from the Chinese government needed to be manufactured by factories that had been in operation for over a year. And at that point, that effectively eliminated the Japanese and the Korean competitors because they were in the process of building their factories and then they couldn't participate in that. So that's the kind of, very small but very significant barrier that China could put in place under this Made in China 2025 that really prevents fair competition from the outside. And then, of course, there's the internet, which has become far more constrained under Xi Jinping. And the latest move was to declare that all virtual private networks, which is the way in which people in China, both Chinese people and multinationals, for example, get around the Great Firewall to access information outside the country, all of those VPNs need to be controlled by the Chinese government. Interestingly, so that was supposed to come into force on March 31st. Apparently, there hasn't actually been action on that, so maybe we'll wait to see whether or not they're really going to push forward with that completely. Again, multinationals have pushed back very aggressively because China also has a very slow internet. It's very interesting for such a technologically, advanced and becoming dominant type of country. Its internet speed is ranked like 111th in the world because of all of the controls it puts on and the censorship and the Great Firewall. And then finally, I think one of the sort of transformative areas that we feel or see most directly here in the United States and elsewhere in the world is the shift from Deng Xiaoping's low-profile foreign policy to a far more ambitious and expansive, did I lose my mic? No, sorry, expansive foreign policy. There.
Yep.
Okay, sorry. And I think I'll just pick off three areas in which I think we can see this. I think first, in terms of China moving from staking claims in its sovereignty, so the South China Sea or Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, to trying to realize that. So if you look at, prior to Xi Jinping in the South China Sea, for example, of course, there were incidents with Vietnamese or Philippine fishing boats, little sort of confrontations in the South China Sea. But China didn't really become assertive in the South China Sea in terms of the land reclamation and militarization of the artificial features until 2014, 2015. So that's a pretty big shift that we see taking place in the South China Sea from, saying, we claim, basically 80 to 90% of the South China Sea as our sovereign maritime domain, to actually trying to take control of that area. And the same thing can be said in, I think, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. We can talk more about that in Q&A if you'd like, about how I think that they're pushing forward there. A second element is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's very grand-scale initiative to connect China to first about 64, then 68, and now the entire world through infrastructure, primarily hard infrastructure, pipelines and ports and railroads and highways, but now there's a digital belt and road, so it includes satellite systems and fiber optic cables and e-commerce. China has talked about a polar ice belt so that it will have a faster trading route from China to Europe. There is a security element to this. China controls or has a majority stake in about 76 ports in 35 countries. And although it says that the ports are for commercial purposes, we've seen in a number of instances that the ports have been visited by PLA Navy ships after China has assumed control. It established its first logistics base in Djibouti, and there's certainly talk within China of more bases yet to come. Understandably, I think, China is a major military power, but somewhat at odds with other things that China sometimes says with regard to its global ambitions. So the Belt and Road is an evolving concept, and it sort of has morphed from simply an infrastructure plan to something that has security and I would argue political ambitions. And this is a sort of source of some discussion, debate, and dispute in the China community about whether or not China is trying to export a political model. But I will say that it is very active in a number of African countries and some in Southeast Asia in terms of helping the governments there to promote stability by training them in propaganda and other stabilizing efforts. So I think there is an element in any case in which China is in fact trying to export a political model. And then finally, I think one thing that doesn't get very much attention here in terms of China's likely impact on the global system is the extent to which China wants its values, its priorities, its policies to be reflected in the realm of global governance. And Xi Jinping, in a speech in 2014, he said, China should be engaged not only in helping to write the rules of the game, but also creating the playgrounds on which the games are played. And I see this very much as China looking at systems, whether it's human rights or it's internet governance or the Arctic, and saying, what are our interests in these areas? Are we going to be a system maintainer, a system reformer, or are we actually going to revolutionize the system in some way? And I think across different regimes and institutions and norms, China plays very differently depending on how it answers that question. But I think it's something that we all need to be aware of and to understand that this power is not simply rising. I believe that it has risen, and it is very much actively engaged in trying to shape the world around it. So I'll just finish by saying when I think about China, I think about China under Xi Jinping as a country that is more now authoritarian and controlling, and in some respects even insular, and also on the inside, but also far more ambitious and expansive in its global aims.
I'm going to talk to Liz for about 10 minutes about the book, and then we'll get your questions and comments. One of the things I was really seized upon by reading the book, I was down there talking to Liz, and I said, I think it's a great story. She said, you think it's a great story? And I said, the size of it, the immensity of it. I also said, I was there 40 years ago, and the changes are just staggering in that time. But one of the things I was really grabbed by was something you mentioned, the social credit score, a way of really apparently governing sort of every aspect of your behavior on which things as simple as you said of getting a fast train or on an airplane depend. And then I ran across this phrase, I'm sure you're familiar with it, where newspaper readers were instructed to, quote, carve Xi Jinping's speech into our bones and dissolve his spirit into our blood. That sounds preposterous to me. What does it sound like to a Chinese person?
I think to some Chinese, it sounds just fine. I think that there are wide swaths of the Chinese populace that are very proud of Xi Jinping. They're pleased with what he's doing in terms of the anti-corruption campaign. They're proud of how he stood up on the global stage. They like the idea of this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So I think hearing that kind of thing, they understand that sort of patriotic sentiment. I think there are many others, in the sort of more liberal intellectual elite in civil society, in the parts of Chinese society that become maybe a little bit more globalized, for whom it sounds a little bit frightening. I think they would reflect more on the things like the upending of the two-term presidential limit, Xi Jinping's disregard for things that were maybe not fully institutionalized, like signaling a successor, but they believed had become institutionalized, new constraints on the internet, the sense that their voices cannot be heard as much as they had been heard before Xi Jinping took power. So I think for those people, that sort of sentiment is frightening.
You mentioned a couple of times pushback. How much pushback is there in Chinese life? And I think you sort of mentioned some institutional pushback or business pushback, but also individual pushback. Is there dissent in China right now?
Sure, of course. I mean, one of the difficult things about China always is that it, even at the height of sort of the internet as a virtual political space, when there was a lot of discussion and debate and talk of political reform and people were pushing for environmental activism and change, still the system is fundamentally opaque. You can't open Renmin or Bao and just read about what's going on in the inner workings of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So, what do you have to live to understand by? You look to hear senior officials say things like, Xi Jinping's security is not secure, right? That this was, not only was this person corrupt, but also he was part of a coup attempt against Xi Jinping. So, if these things are to be believed, there have been a couple of different coup efforts. I've certainly heard when I've been in China that many senior officials are very disturbed by many of Xi Jinping's actions, not only in terms of
even by what happened in March when he basically
right. Very disturbed by that,
right.
exactly. Right. So that was disturbing to them. So some of the old retired officials. Of course, they're also disturbed by the anti-corruption campaign going after many of their friends. But I think, again, that lack of regard for institutions that they thought they had put in place, I think, has been problematic. But I think more broadly what you see is, China is subjected and is part of the globalized system when it comes to things like a feminist movement, or an LGBT movement. And these things continue to bring pressure to bear on the government. So when 5 feminists were arrested, there was a huge international outcry. There was a huge outcry within China about it too, and then they were released, and they continue to push forward. So environmental activists continue to push forward. So I think we don't want to say that he's eliminated all sort of political activism or dissenting views, but certainly I would say in the upper echelons, when I was in China in March, I was talking to someone who holds an official position, is also a scholar, and he said they don't feel as though the opportunity to voice different ideas from those expressed by Xi Jinping, that opportunity is there anymore. And so they're looking for ways to get that opportunity back by putting in new little regulations and laws, but it's very difficult. So I think there's dissent, but whether that dissent can be mobilized and activated, I think to actually make change, that's a different issue.
When Antonio Guterres became Secretary General across the street last year, it was a time when we already had indications that the Trump administration would be interested in withdrawing from international agreements, from formal pacts, from the TPP, basically not participating in multilateral diplomacy, which is basically what that is the temple of over there. And by the way, what we believe in here as well. And Guterres can't criticize the United States directly. No Secretary General of the UN can, because it's the most important relationship with a nation they have. But he said, and nobody doubted what he was talking about, he said, be careful because there are other people who may move into that space. He obviously was talking about China. The overall feeling that the Trump administration is giving China opportunities to assert itself and to perform in an international cooperative way, is China really capable of doing that? I mean, after all, they don't really have many allies. I'm not sure we do anymore either, but they really don't. They don't really believe in norms that govern other countries than themselves. I guess the broad question is, can China take advantage of this moment, and can China really step in and assume some of the world leadership that the United States seems to be abandoning?
Right. So there was certainly a moment, I think, when Xi Jinping stood on the stage at Davos a year and several months ago now, and said that, China was going to be a defender of globalization and a leader, and we will remain open and not close, when a lot of, your former colleagues, the journalist community, all jumped on the bandwagon and said that China is replacing the United States, et cetera. But the truth is that, globalization, what does it even mean? It means the free flow of capital, maybe the free flow of information. China doesn't practice either one of those things. And so Xi Jinping can rhetorically claim leadership, but actually can China be a leader in globalization when it doesn't really defend the primary principles of globalization? I don't think so. I think I look to China, when I think about what Chinese leadership would look like, I would want to see China step up on the global stage on issues like refugees, right? So China, one would think, would play a much larger and more constructive role in its own backyard with regard to, Myanmar and Bangladesh and the 750,000 or more Rohingya that have been, fleeing.
And they don't.
They've done some moderate moves, but they're certainly not a major leadership role in resolving the crisis, I would argue. China's Belt and Road Initiative, I think, has the potential to demonstrate Chinese global leadership, but the way that they pursue it, if you look at all the different countries in which China has projects underway, there are protests against the way that China is doing business in virtually every one of those places.
And they also become so indebted to China that the ports and buildings they're building eventually end up Chinese and not.
Well, right. That's one big concern that, in fact, in many cases, it's interesting, it's not Chinese investment in Belt and Road, it's Chinese lending. So actually, if you look at investment in Belt and Road countries, really Chinese investment in Belt and Road countries is only 10% of their overall foreign direct investment. So the vast majority goes to Europe, a lot has gone to the United States, but very little goes to the Belt and Road countries, and actually the three largest are Pakistan, Indonesia, and Malaysia. But many other smaller countries, it's right, I think Moody's and others have evaluated the levels of debt of many of these small countries that are taking in a lot of Chinese loans, and said 10 to 15 of them, they don't believe will ever be able to repay these loans. So I think that's one issue, but there are also others. There's issues in the way that the bidding process is being done. Is it transparent? There are issues in the environmental practices. China is cutting down on its own coal usage, but exporting huge numbers of coal-fired power plants abroad, and not the top-of-the-line sort of ultra-supercritical coal-fired power plants that it's been putting in its own country, but lesser quality ones. So I think that there are issues around the way that the China is pursuing the Belt and Road that to some extent diminish its potential for China to claim global leadership in a truly positive way. So I think, could China do it? Given the U.S. withdrawal, it could, but I don't think it's ready.
The United States experience post-World War II, second half of the 20th century, extending its leadership, its interests, its ideas abroad, created vast pockets of anti-Americanism. Are we seeing xenophobia now being created?
Yeah, I think certainly, and it's not that new. In fact, if you look back when Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji first began their sort of go-out strategy in the late 1990s, 1999, that was a time when China was going out in search of resources to fuel its economic growth. Even then, you had problems of the same sort that you're seeing with the Belt and Road now, in terms of Chinese sending its labor abroad instead of giving job to local people. In fact, that's another complaint about the Belt and Road, is that 89% of the infrastructure projects under the Belt and Road umbrella are being done by Chinese construction firms, right? And that's, compares to about 30% for non-Belt and Road projects. So that's a big difference.
I saw enormous resentment in places like South Sudan, for instance, when I was there, at the Chinese building everything, but with their own workers.
Right. So that's one issue. I mean, the other thing that I think you're probably talking about is a different kind of xenophobia. that I'm quite concerned about, and that's what I think we see in Australia and New Zealand, and certainly beginning to burble up here, and that's sort of the idea of Chinese influence and sort of penetration of our political system or our educational system. And I think here we need to be extremely careful in how we talk about it, how we think about it, and how we address it.
Can you talk a bit about the Confucius organizations? Because they promote that, don't they, abroad?
So the Confucius Institutes are mostly language training centers, and we have about 500 of them, either centers or classrooms, because in some, K through 8s in high schools, they're just classrooms, Confucius classrooms, and they teach Chinese language. So what is the issue surrounding them? The issue is that the Chinese government pays for the Chinese language instruction, they pay for the teachers, and they choose the curriculum, and they choose the teachers. So we know the teachers can't be Falun Gong practitioners, right? There are going to be political constraints on the teachers. We look at the curriculum, right? So could you imagine a class in newspaper Chinese, like the one that I took when I was in graduate school, that would actually have articles dealing with, Chinese protests, right? Or if you were during the time of Tiananmen, would they be open to talking about what was going on in Tiananmen at the time? And so I think, are you in some way with these Confucius Institutes constraining the education of Chinese language students here in the United States, right? Are you basically offloading, an American curriculum to a Chinese, to Chinese principles and values and its curriculum? To me, the answer is yes, it's a mistake. But what do you do about it then? That becomes the question. And so instead of what we see now, which is this vast effort emanating from Congress, just to tell all universities, eliminate your Confucius Institutes, right? You could say, all right, take the Confucius Institutes and move them off campus, right? Make them Goethe Institutes, Alliance Française, whatever, so that people can elect to attend them, understanding what the curriculum is going to be, or have the Chinese fund them, but they can't have control. Governance remains with the university. They can't control the curriculum or the choice of teachers, but they're still getting the positive element of promoting Chinese language instruction and cultural opportunities. To me, that's the better answer, right? See whether or not we can work with the Chinese government to have that arrangement established. But I think what we've got going now in Congress is actually very frightening, and because it is beginning to feel like a witch hunt, and everything Chinese, Chinese students, Chinese Confucius Institute, Chinese everything, they're all coming under fire in very frightening ways.
Liz, what do you think the Chinese make of Trump? Do they think they can take advantage of him? I'm not sure it's possible. 1.3 billion people, what do they speak of somebody? But what do they think of Trump?
So let me just talk about the type of people that I interact with, because that's really what I could speak to. And so those tend to be some officials and sort of scholars in universities and think tanks. And so I've probably gone to China maybe 3 or 4 times since President Trump was elected. And I would say the mood has shifted over time. I think at first, he was unpredictable. They didn't know what to think. Then they kind of thought, okay, he's unpredictable, but we get it. He's sort of predictable in his unpredictability. It's all within a sort of range, and we understand it, and we can deal with it, and we can manage it. Plus, he keeps saying all these great things about our president, so, not so bad, right? Then when I was there again in this last trip in March, they were a little bit rocked. And they were rocked, why? Because President Trump had just signed into law the Taiwan Travel Act, which promotes senior level visits between Taiwanese and American officials. They didn't really like that very much. He had just threatened one big round of tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods, 25% tariffs. And he had just announced that he was going to be meeting with Kim Jong-un. And that surprised them too. And so they were a little bit worried about being marginalized. So, for example, one think tank analyst said to me, well, you better hold the meeting in Beijing, because if you don't, nothing is going to come of this meeting. So at that point, I think they began to think maybe he's not as predictable as we thought, and a little bit more difficult to deal with than we thought. But they also laughed at the fact that, at one point he said, instead of saying, $100 billion that he wanted to have the trade deficit reduced by 100 billion, the bilateral trade deficit. He said 1 billion.
Yep.
So, they poke fun at his missteps, and, there's that element as well.
Stay with the Korea example. The Chinese did have that moment where Kim suddenly shows up in Beijing twice, and it seemed they kind of got control of that thing again. But just talk in the future, what do you think the Chinese make of what's happening now in Korea with the Americans, and do you think they will maintain control of it?
Well, so I'm not sure they feel like they have control over it. I think, it was challenging for them because Kim Jong-un agreed to meet with President Trump, but didn't adopt the Chinese proposal, right? The Chinese had proposed the freeze for freeze, that the US and South Korea would freeze their military exercises and North Korea would freeze its testing. And instead, Kim Jong-un went right up and said, we'll freeze testing, and didn't ask for anything from the Trump administration. And so China lost that little leverage, right? That was a major source of, a major objective for the Chinese was to get the United States and South Korea to stop their military exercises. And so that was one thing that Kim took off the table right from the beginning. And you're right, then all of a sudden you had the two meetings. Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping had never met, right? In 5 years, they had never met. The relationship was strained. There are a lot of people within China that believe that North Korea is basically a millstone around China's neck. They didn't see much value out of the relationship. Not everybody. Certainly there are those that considered an important ally and friend. But I had a lot of debate about North Korea within China. I think now they look... I will say one other thing that somebody said during this set of meetings was they were worried that, in fact, Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un might hit it off, right? And the fact that Kim Jong-un would speak in English to Xi Jinping would somehow, form some bridge or something. So there's a lot going on in the Chinese minds about what might happen. These are two very unpredictable actors. So I would doubt that the Chinese leaders feel as though they have this situation under control.
Actually, one last thing before I see what's on people's minds, and that is, I'm starting to forget what that. Hang on, it was. What's the last question I wanted to ask you? I was saving it to the end, and now I forget what it was.
No, probably was a tough one. So maybe we can just go to audience questions.
We may have to go to the audience, and I'll come back and remember what I had in my mind. But it was. Part of it was. He is taking responsibility for everything. Will he be blamed when things start to go wrong?
Yeah. I think, one of the challenges is, you're right, he's taken control of almost everything.
You said yourself in the beginning, much more than anybody ever has.
No, that's right. And he's created a lot of enemies. And so one might imagine that if things go dramatically wrong in some context, if the economy, slows down dramatically, if there's some major environmental disaster, if, for example, there's some kind of little dust up in the South China Sea or over Taiwan and China doesn't come out looking good, so some sort of international embarrassment, or a lot of international pushback, like what's going on right now, really develops into a big swell of opposition. One could imagine that all of those people will come out of the woodwork and that he will be at risk. You never say never. Again, I just go back to that point about the opacity of the leadership. And, I was a student of the Soviet Union, and who would have predicted Gorbachev? I just would never say never.
It's an enormous army of people who he has offended, who are just ready to pounce, I would imagine, the minute he makes a mistake. Anyhow, I would love to get some questions from the floor. If you'd raise your hand, I'll ask you to wait for, we'll send a microphone. We'll start here in the second row and then right behind. And is there a third question? Did you raise your hand? Oh, good. And if you would, if I could ask you to stand up, it's easier for the camera in the back.
Name?
And please identify yourself.
Lynn Gillis, just a question about your thoughts about the future. How would you compare the U.S. and China?
Can you all hear? Or you have to hold that
How would you
microphone?
compare the U.S. and China, just hypothetically, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, in terms of GDP and growth rate and industry and so on? How do you think they might stack up military?
Yeah, in terms of growth rate or the size of the economy? I think the Chinese growth rate is slowing, and Xi Jinping has said that he wants it to slow, right? He wants better balanced growth. If you look at his 3 priorities for the next 5 years that he set out in March, he said he wants to deleverage the economy because there's an enormous amount of debt in the economy, and it's risen rapidly. He wants to address the environmental challenges, and he wants to address poverty. And I think one thing we tend to forget about China is that still 40% of the country lives on, $5.50 a day or less, right? And I think that gets lost in our sense of this vast, impressive country and all it's accomplished and the challenge that we believe that it poses to the United States. I think projecting out 20 years, what does it look like? If you were to continue on the trajectory that we're on today, I think we are not going to look very good, certainly. China has the potential to look quite good. But I think things can change, on a dime. And people tend to think what we see now is what we're going to see for the next 5 or 10 years. I think we can just look back 5 years in both our countries and realize how very untrue that statement is. The United States looked radically different 5 years ago, as did China. So I don't really want to take on that projection, except to say, like I said, if we were to continue in a parallel, on the current trajectory, I think we would end up the loser, the greater loser. But I'm not prepared to make that bet.
Right.
Hi, Robin Meredith. Great talk, Liz.
Oh, thanks, Robin.
Congratulations. 2 questions, actually.
Hold it up, Robin, to the...
2 questions,
Thank you.
please. First, maybe a simpler one. How do you think that Xi Jinping is looking at the trade talks going on right now with Trump? And the second question is, we've just had the 29th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. And what was interesting to me is the reaction in Hong Kong, in which the sort of demonstrators were split between a younger generation who was more concerned about democracy in Hong Kong and an older generation more concerned about remembering Tiananmen. Could you talk about how the territories China views as China's are reacting to it?
Okay. So I think to the first question, how is Xi Jinping looking at the trade issue? I think if you go back to February, when his top trade person and economist Liu He came to the United States, and that was at a moment when I think China was looking to try to figure out, okay, we're not interested in having something, big trade war erupt. We don't want to go down that path. And Liu He left without meeting President Trump, and from what I understand from Chinese, that got 3 different messages from 3 different parts of the administration. We're not speaking with a unified voice. Went back. Then we had the tariff the Chinese response with their own tariffs, backing back again, and then we have the most recent visit. I think at this point they're looking at the United States and thinking, for whatever reason, you're shooting yourselves in the foot. You're taking on the Europeans now, with the steel and aluminum, and the Canadians and the Mexicans. We're sitting pretty, right? Because we're getting all these new friends, right, by virtue of what you're doing. And so I think already the Europeans were looking to join the Chinese in some action through the WTO. I'm sure now it's just going to be pile-on time. Look, they don't want to end up in a trade war with the United States. Certainly their economy is more exposed to ours than ours is to theirs. But I think at the moment, they think that the United States is, under siege, and I think they feel like they can, they can pretty much sit back and watch this, I was going to say something, not whatever, show, anyway. So in terms of what's happening in Hong Kong, I think there are probably a number of different divides and cross-currents within the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. There are those who believe, like Joshua Wong, that ultimately Hong Kong wants to be completely sovereign, independent territory from China. There are others in the legal sphere who are just bound and determined to try to maintain the autonomy that's been granted under the Basic Law, that should be granted under the Basic Law, but which China is beginning to erode. And I think there are others that find some other kind of middle ground, or people who want to be elected and work within the system to try to push gradually. So I think we're seeing many different elements within that community emerge. Normally, I would say that kind of fractured community it's going to weaken the community, but I think that the incredibly devastating truth is that there's very little sort of strength in some ways that they can draw on, both at home and abroad, to advance their case. I mean, certainly there are many communities abroad that are supportive, but I think it's very challenging. And so much as I would like to be optimistic on their behalf, I think it's difficult.
I know I've got a question in the back.
Good evening. I work for the International Organization for Migration, and it's very interesting for me that you mentioned China's policy towards refugees. You were saying instead of taking a larger responsibility, they actually are taking moderate moves. So I wonder, I know it's a controversial issue, but I wonder what is your view of the motive behind?
Well, I think there may be a couple different issues at stake, right? So despite the fact that China engages very deeply in the economies and militaries and politics of many countries, it still maintains its principle of non-intervention and sovereignty and not wanting to engage. So I think on a formal level, that's one element. I think it has deep economic engagement, certainly in Myanmar, if we're just talking about that particular issue. It has its own economic interests. It has its own conflict underway with parts of Myanmar, its own engagement in conflict areas. So I think there's a consideration. I think it's not necessarily interested in having a big human rights intervention in Myanmar, as opposed to some other countries that would like to see independent human rights investigation into the situation. So I think it has many different elements to why it's not becoming more deeply engaged. And I think then it also isn't prepared to open its own borders, right? So if you look more broadly at the issue of refugees in the world, right, it is one of the great issues that our world confronts. I mean, many countries are closing off their borders, but China has never opened its borders. So I think that's another reason it probably doesn't want to become too deeply engaged, because that would probably bring some scrutiny on its own reluctance to welcome in those less fortunate.
And also has problems with its own minorities.
It certainly, yes, has that as well.
Please, an old friend.
Hi, thank you very much for your...
Introduce yourself,
Oh,
Judy.
I'm sorry. I'm Judy Miller from the Manhattan Institute and Fox News. I'm curious, when I was researching the old, battled Soviet biological weapons program, I was struck by the fact that the Russians were very motivated, not by having weapons that could confront the United States. They thought missiles and nuclear weapons would do that, but they were very focused on biological weapons aimed at the Chinese, whom almost every scientist identified as Russia's natural enemy. What is the view today of the Chinese view of their troublesome neighbor? Do they see it as just a declining power, or a power with which they must reckon? Thank you.
You know what, that's a very well-placed question. Liz began life as a Russia expert
Yes.
before she switched over
That's
to
why
China.
I
As a
asked.
Soviet expert, because I'm way older than just a Russia expert.
Thank
yeah.
you.
So I think Xi Jinping will often reference the former Soviet Union and Gorbachev as exactly what he will never allow China to become, right? So I think that's one way in which he looks at Russia as a former great power that has, in fact, declined it to a second-tier power. Russia, as I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience, Russia and China are often aligned in the United Nations, but they have been for decades on many different issues. They do military exercises together. They have increasingly robust, but still not enormous levels of trade, not comparative, for example, not comparable to the U.S.-China trade relationship. I think there's a competitive element, for example, when you look at China and Russia in Central Asia, but it's a competition that, the Chinese maybe are likely to win. Russia has to some extent subordinated its idea of a Eurasian Economic Union it's brought it into the Belt and Road initiative, so it's kind of joined it up with that. I think China, for the most part, looks at Russia like a junior partner. And I think Russia is trying to get out of that space to be an equal partner. But I'm not sure China's going to let that happen.
Does Belt and Road go through Russia or previously Soviet territory?
Yeah,
It does.
absolutely. I mean, Kazakhstan is major Belt and Road part. Central Asia is a big part of the Belt and Road.
But a Belt and Road would sort of exclude the Russians from...
No, I'm trying to think now. There are 6 different corridors to the Belt and Road, and I'm trying to remember all the different ones. But
Silk Route, I know,
yeah, it goes through the Middle East. But yeah, it's not exactly the Silk Road. It's, again, 6 different corridors that are like little parts of things. And now they're competing ones with the Indians and the Japanese. Many different actors have come into play in developing their own corridors.
Can they pull this off, the Made in China 2025 and Belt and Road? These are colossal projects.
Well, Made in China 2025 is, in some respects, not that colossal. Because it's really just protectionist industrial policy. It sounds colossal, and it's important, and it's impressive, but it shouldn't be that difficult for the Chinese to do unless there's a united effort on the part of the US and Japan and the EU to push back. I think the one way in which Made in China 2025 could be slowed down, and perhaps is being slowed down, is by all of the new investment restrictions that are being put in place by places like the United States and other places. Europe, Japan is writing new investment restrictions because at one point back in 2016, the Chinese were looking to acquire one German company on average every single week. And so the Germans became very concerned about that. So many countries now have become concerned about the hollowing out of their technology, their core technology capabilities. And so everyone is in the process of rewriting their investment regulations to prevent, broadening the remit, for example, of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So it makes it much more difficult for something like that to happen. And that is one part of Made in China 2025 is, getting technology. The technology itself doesn't have to be homegrown. Chinese companies can go out and acquire it. And so if you're slowing down that process, that will slow down Made in China 2025. But eventually, they can do it. I mean, they did it with wind power. They've done it with solar power.
You mentioned earlier their deep suspicion of Western influence. And yet so many Chinese send their children to school in the West, including Xi Jinping. I think his daughter went to Harvard, yes?
Yes, she did.
Tell me about that. Are they not afraid their children will succumb to the blandishments of Western culture, or are they just secure in the knowledge that a young Chinese person will believe so much in hers or her? Or finally, is there a repressive part? Do they know that if they don't hear the line, the family back in China will be punished?
So I think all of those are true, right? I think, different Chinese families have different motives in sending their children abroad. I mean, some, I think, genuinely want children, and the students themselves want to be exposed to the openness and the different type of educational system that they get in the United States or the UK or Canada or Australia. I think others come because they believe still that these other countries offer a scientific education for basic research that is more advanced or allows for greater creativity than they can do in China. But fundamentally, politically, they're not interested in getting all the different ideas coming in. I also think there's a challenge in that we're seeing more and more in college campuses large groups of Chinese just living in enclaves, right? So that entire apartment buildings...
You mean on Western campuses?
On Western campuses, right. So entire apartment buildings that are just Chinese students, right? Or I even heard of a university, a big university, American university, where the university has on purpose put Chinese students together so that they can all take advantage of English as a second language kind of extra training and things like that. I think that's problematic. It's problematic both in terms of defeating half the purpose of going to study abroad, which is learning about the other culture and integrating with your fellow students and learning both the good and the bad. And it's also problematic because of what we've heard and read about, the development of Communist Party cells and spying on other students and, limiting the ability of some Chinese students to participate in class, making them afraid of, voicing their own opinions. And I think that kind of intensive Chinese living experience only exacerbates that problem because the eyes are sort of everywhere on those Chinese students. So I think that's a problem as well.
We'll start here in the front row and then in a second, and I'll take more.
Thank you. Roy Levitt, and your information on China has been so expansive. The information is terrific, but one thing you haven't touched on is their outreach in terms of cybercrime.
China and hacking. So I think most people would agree that when President Obama, when they signed the agreement on economic espionage, so the Chinese government directed economic espionage, they signed an agreement, so China agreed that they wouldn't undertake that. That most companies have seen a pretty dramatic decrease in the efforts at hacking. So that was actually successful. Nonetheless, you can certainly read about 200 law firms in the United States that have been subjected to, on average, 10,000 efforts a day to gain access to proprietary information on sort of M&A deals, right, and other things on their clients. There was the Office of Personnel Management hack that took place. So things are still happening, it's clear. I think the Chinese government has tried to rein in those people who might have been working for the Chinese government hackers during the day, but freelancing at night, and stopping the freelancing at night. But I think it's still taking place. Maybe the exact nature of the hacking has shifted a little bit, but it's still engaged in hacking efforts.
Good.
Thank you. My name is Vanessa Malter. I'm a German student and currently an intern at the German mission. My first question relates to Western Chinese investment. You touched upon investment from Chinese companies and German companies, and I was wondering how your opinion on that is in general, if it should be encouraged or rather cut off in both countries. And also, I've read a lot about the Thucydides trap. I'm sure as a China scholar you've heard of it. And one of the solutions proposed is cross-national investment. And how do you view it in this context, and how do you see the risk of a war? Thank you.
Sure. So, one of the things, it's interesting, when I was doing the research for the book and writing the book, I tend to, in the sort of world of China scholars and experts, I tend to err on the side of being a little bit tougher. And so in the book, for example, I suggest that the U.S. ought to adopt some reciprocity. So this is before all of this is taking place here in the United States. And one of the things I talk about is investment. So I think, yes, we should be pursuing a bilateral investment treaty with China. That's important. So promoting investment on equal terms. But in the meantime, right, I think an effective strategy could also be to say, you don't allow investment in X and Y and Z sectors. Well, we need to close off that investment to you. That's very controversial. Many people don't like reciprocity as a tool. They say it leads to a downward spiral, where there is no floor, and it's lose-lose proposition, right? And you could see it whether you're talking about visas or investment or Confucius Institutes and American corners, whatever it is. But my argument is that China is so large now, its economy is so big, that we can't afford to believe and to argue anymore that if we simply model best behavior, right, we retain openness, that China is going to follow suit. And that holds true whether it's intellectual property rights, or it's Chinese providing subsidies to their companies, or just the general openness and lack of market, barriers in the United States economy to Chinese investment. So what I am afraid of, though, is what we're seeing now with Congress again. As with the Confucius Institutes, these kinds of moves, this sort of reciprocity game, is a serious one, and it should be undertaken with the greatest care and with time and with a scalpel and not a sledgehammer. And I feel a little bit like a monster. The beast has been unleashed in Congress right now, and they're operating without a very strong sense of exactly how to proceed in a kind of smart and nuanced way. So in principle, I think that reciprocity can be important, and restricting investment can be important as a mechanism of forcing the Chinese to open their market. But I'm afraid that's not the path that we're going down. As an aside, on the tech side, the technological side, I have to say, I do view China as a strategic competitor. I am concerned about what they're doing in the military sphere. And so I am in favor of protecting our core technologies and really thinking through very seriously what technologies have dual use and how things can be used, and preventing them from, sucking up our semiconductor industry, for example.
Liz, what is it like for a Western scholar in China now? Do you have access? Are you suspect? Do they assign minders to you when you go?
No, they don't assign minders to me. They know me. I mean, people in the foreign ministry, they know me, all of the scholars and things. I mean, I've been going back and forth for more than 20 years at this point. I think life is difficult for China scholars, actually. Getting visas is become Western scholars. Yeah, for China scholars, yeah. Sorry, not Chinese scholars, for China scholars, right? For Western scholars who work on China, it's very difficult. So getting visas has become far more difficult. Oftentimes the Chinese will either not grant a visa, or they will wait till right the day that you're supposed to leave to say, oh, you can have a visa, or say, oh, you can have a visa, but actually it's going to be for 2 days after you're supposed to leave. So it's become very, very challenging, mostly only single entry visas, as opposed to the fact, here in the United States, we'll give my counterpart 10-year visas, right? We can barely get, I typically have gotten 1-year multiple entry. I just have my visa in right now. If there's anybody from the Chinese consulate here, can I get it back, please? And I'd like that again. But anyway, most of my contemporaries only get single entry. Some people can get a visa, but they're told they are not able to meet with anybody. Some people are said, you can go meet with your families, but you can't meet with officials. So there are many different kinds of restrictions and regulations that are put on Western scholars who want to study in China. Very difficult to do on-the-ground research anymore. Projects that might have taken you into multiple provinces, almost forget about it with Chinese counterparts. Everything now comes under this new NGO.
Couldn't do that before?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's much more difficult. Everything comes under this NGO law. You have to get permission, like separate permission for every province that you'd want to do this kind of work in. So life is harder. Life is harder.
Please.
Charles Van
Actually, just stand to the side because you're right in front of the camera.
Sorry, Charles Van I work for the UN for OCHA. A question, China is changing a lot, US is changing a lot. What about Taiwan? And we see more and more countries who recognize China instead of Taiwan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Taiwan is one of those, the most sensitive issues in the US-China relationship. And I think China has become increasingly concerned about the direction of Taiwan. Of course, with Tsai Ing-wen as president, they have canceled all senior visits, so they don't have any negotiations underway now. And I think there are a number of little coercive policies they've undertaken, like telling tourist agencies to decrease the number of tourists going to Taiwan. On the other hand, there are some inducements. They've talked about offering Taiwanese companies national treatment, providing them with free office space or subsidies or other things to induce Taiwanese companies to establish themselves in Taiwan. So I think it's a mix of trying to attract those who might be interested in closer relations with China at the same time as pushing them, those who don't, not engaging with them. I think when it comes to the United States, we have, I would say, and we've moved to enhance our relationship with Taiwan under the Trump administration. After some confusion in the first months of the Trump administration, again, the president signed the Taiwan Travel Act. The government has agreed to license, has provided the marketing license so that companies can sell the technology to Taiwan to allow it to build its own submarines. We have, of course, encouraged our airlines not to succumb to Chinese pressure in terms of not identifying Taiwan as a separate entity on the airlines' websites, calling it, Orwellian nonsense on the part of the Chinese government. So I think we have, I know pretty well the people in this administration who are working on China policy in the National Security Council and in the Defense Department. And I would say there are people who are committed to Taiwan in a fairly fundamental way. Whether that holds all the way up through the administration when push comes to shove, I don't know. I don't think the president certainly hasn't articulated a policy on Taiwan and China. But we've taken several steps that would suggest that we are buttressing our Taiwan relationship, despite the fact that, yes, many smaller countries are no longer recognizing. We'll see whether and whom they send to the opening of the new big, American representative office in Taiwan, whether we send a relatively senior official or not. Yeah, it does, certainly does.
I will ask one last question.
One more back there.
Is there a hand up somewhere?
One
Please.
person.
I'm sorry. Please.
Thank you for your talk. I'm an outsider. I work in finance. I do investment. And I'm Chinese. So your book is a revolution under Xi Jinping. And revolution, this word sounds a little bit scary, at least to me, because the last one is the Cultural Revolution. So, I'm just thinking whether, I know there's a lot of rapid change socially and economically, especially under Xi's government. Is this actually, because of the development of technology and economy is so fast, is this a natural demand from the change of the society, from the economy, or rather this is political and socially revolution from Xi and Xi's government? Because the society has developed so fast, and then because China's government has been developing from it has developed from ground zero. There's lot of lack of policies and laws. So for example, the trust system, I would understand it as a credit score in the United States. And for the AI system in a railway station, because I'm sure you have been to the railway station in China, there's just so many people. It might be a good way of using technology for the social society management. So I just want to just throw out this idea, and also hear your opinion about this. This is natural development, or this is actually a political revolution.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Great question. Brings it all the way back to the essence of the book.
Yeah.
So I think, as to not make it scary, which of course the Cultural Revolution was very scary, I use the word revolution because I do think that the processes of political and economic and sort of foreign policy, that all of those things are undergoing fundamental change. And don't forget, Deng Xiaoping called his period of reform and opening up the second revolution. He himself called it that, so think of it in that context. That's how I'm terming it, not as a cultural revolution. But in terms of whether or not this is what I detail in the book, what I see in the book, is a natural evolution emanating from just societal change and technology, I would say no. I think, in fact, it's the opposite. That if you were to look back again at 2011 and 2012, Chinese society was moving in the precisely opposite direction, right? Because you look at the internet at that point in time, and you had people like Pan Shi, conducting polls of the Chinese people on whether or not they should push for the Chinese government to do more to address the air quality issue, right? You had the Beijing floods, you had masses of people in Beijing uniting, coming together to help each other through the floods. What was it, 2 or 3 years later, I think it was in Hebei, they had another set of floods, or maybe it was Zhejiang, now I can't remember, another set of floods, and everything was clamped down, right? So none of that kind of community building and sharing experience. From my perspective, Chinese society was moving in a direction that was more open and more transparent and more engaged one with the other, and it's a political and economic shift that's being undertaken from above, not from below.
Oh, please. Wait for the microphone, Joni.
Thank you.
And this will be the last question, because I promised to give...
Joni Sherbo, Resource Center for Cultural Engagement. Apropos of your answer to that question, China, I've been astounded at how China has expanded in Africa and even now in South America. And the Confucius Institutes, which are not more than just language institutes, they do an immense amount of propaganda or introduction to Chinese culture and society. How is that going to track with this insularity and this growing autocracy, their ability to expand and to continue this way?
Right, so I should make it clear that China believes it wants to control what comes in, but what it sends out is something different. It wants to send out a lot, but not take in so much. And so, they've, now they have Voice of China, right, like Voice of America. So they're establishing, radio stations and newspapers and everything globally. I mean, inserts of the China Daily, in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Politico now is partnering with the South China Morning Post. So all of this, I think, is in service of getting the Chinese narrative right out there. In Chinese, Xi Jinping himself has said he believes that the Western media treat China unfairly. And so I think there's an enormous effort, as you say, at public diplomacy or propaganda at some level. But I think, people globally, for the most part, China's soft power is limited because soft power emanates from something organic, right? It's the ideas and the culture that are being, and the values that are being expressed within a society that attract other societies. And I don't think China possesses that because it doesn't allow, it could, but it doesn't allow for that freedom within its own society to make it attractive to so many others. So I think that's a challenge that is still outstanding for them.
Thanks. I promised to give Liz time to sign some books. If you bought them, please bring them. I'm going to keep her right here to sign books. The bar is open, and there's still some food left.
And also, if you didn't buy them, there's still some there, right?
Anyway, Liz, thank you so much. And thank you all for your questions.